One of the greatest artists in recent times was Vincent van Gogh. His paintings collect millions and millions of dollars. They're beautiful paintings, full of color and vibrancy and life. And yet, he had a terrible life. It was full of suffering and tragedy. He only sold one painting in his lifetime, and he died penniless. But after his death, he gained incredible renown. And that's often how it is with great people. Perhaps during their lifetimes they were controversial, or they were not famous, and yet after their death, they are resurrected. And this is hinted to in the name of this week's double parsha. The first parsha is Acharei Mot, after the death. And that refers to the events that happened after the death of the two sons of Aaron that we read about previously, Nadav and Avihu. They came into the sanctuary with a foreign fire, and they tragically died. So at the beginning of this week's parasha, Hashem comes to their father Aaron and says, after the death of your two sons, I now have a special command to you. You are to go into the sanctuary once a year into the Holy of Holies and bring incense. And this is a reference to the service in the temple on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. The second of this week's two parashiot is Kedoshim, to be holy. Hashem says to the Jewish people, Kedoshim tiyu, you shall be holy. But when you take these two parashot and put them together, it reads, Acharei Mot Kedoshim. After the death, they are holy. Almost a hint to us that there are times and circumstances when only after a person's death are they holy. During their lifetime, they were nothing, or they were controversial. But after their death is where they gain renown. Of course, everybody wants to be famous in their lifetime, but sometimes history tells us a different story. And here we have many interesting Jewish characters that during their lifetimes were very, very controversial. But once they had died, the controversy died with them and they became famous. Perhaps the most well-known of these is the Rambam, Maimonides. Which scholar today would not quote the Rambam? Which yeshiva would not have his books in their library? But it wasn't always so. In the Rambam's time, in the time of his life, there was incredible controversy. He wrote the Mishnah Torah, his famous book of Jewish law, but he didn't put any sources, and people were outraged. He wrote books of philosophy, people called him a heretic. They burnt his books in Paris. But after his death, it all settled down. And about 100 or maybe even 50 years after his death, there was nobody who didn't respect the Rambam. Acharei Mot Kedoshim. After the death, he became holy. Another famous and tragic figure was Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the author of Mesilat Yesharim, the Path of the Just. He was an unusually extroverted type of a person with an incredible mind. But at a young age already, he was dabbling in Kabbalah, in the mystical areas of Judaism. And this was after the debacle of the false Messiah Shabbatai Tzvi. So rabbis were on the lookout for young men who seemed to be displaying signs of dabbling in the mystical. And they looked at this young man, Rabbi Luzzatto, who was from Italy, and they thought perhaps he was heading in that direction. And so he found himself persecuted, fleeing from country to country, and always the source of controversy. And yet after his death, there is no yeshiva in the world. There is no scholar who will not study his famous works, his holy works. So again, Acharei Mot Kedoshim. After his death, he became holy. And closer to our times, the Hasidic movement. Today, Hasidim are viewed as ultra-Orthodox, completely conservative, keeping halakha, keeping Jewish law, according to the straight and narrow view of things. But it wasn't always like that. When the Hasidic movement started in the 18th century with Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, they were seen as a radical reform movement. The Vilna Gaon, the greatest scholar of Lithuania, was completely against them. He excommunicated them. He put a ban on them. You couldn't count them in a minyan. You couldn't eat the meat that they had shechted. You couldn't marry into their families. And he never took back that ban. And the heads of the Hasidic movement were viewed with an enormous amount of suspicion. But after their death and after a few generations, the whole argument calmed down and they have become holy. So very often when we see an argument or dispute in Judaism and we wonder who exactly won that dispute, oftentimes in the life of the opponents, you can't tell. But after their death, after history has calmed down, and after the argument has come to a rest, then Acharei Mot Kedoshim. After their death, they become holy. In the same way that the sons of Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, even though they committed a grievous sin, remain holy for all times. And that's why some Jews even fast on their yortzeit. We all strive for holiness in our lifetimes, but some only achieve it in their death. I wish you a Shabbat Shalom.